Hello, this is Mr. Seymour, and this is chapter 15, the last chapter of our study of American government. This chapter is on foreign policy. Foreign policy is full of controversial questions. For example, should Americans provide airstrikes against militant groups such as ISIL, pictured here? Should America's ground forces be deployed against these groups? Debate over these issues intensified during the 2016 election as Republican Donald Trump's campaign emphasized criticisms of the Obama administration's foreign policy. So what is foreign policy? Foreign policy is the term that we give to government actions involving countries, groups, and corporations that are outside of the United States. These include military, economic, human rights, environmental, and foreign assistance activities. Let's look at some principles of foreign policy. First of all, we need to identify unilateral versus multilateral actions. Unilateral action is a question of should we act alone. Multilateral actions are actions that we have in coalition with other countries. So should we act in coalition with other countries or should we act alone? If we act alone, that's unilateral. If we act in coalition with other countries, that's a multilateral action. Isolationism versus internationalism. This is a question of should the United States make alliances and get involved in international affairs. If we make alliances and get involved in international affairs, that's internationalism. If we decide that we want to go it alone, make America great again, decide that other nations aren't paying their way, so we're not going to help them, that's isolationism. Then there's the question of realism versus idealism. How much do a country's actions represent self-interest? If a country's actions represent self-interest, that's realism. If a country's actions represent the good of the whole, that's idealism. When the United States acts multilaterally in foreign policy, it often works through organizations such as the United Nations. Here, President Barack Obama is addressing a session of the United Nations General Assembly. Entangling alliances were a real concern in the early American Republic. Recall that Federalist partisans were often accused of conspiring to reunite with the British Crown, while Democratic Republicans like Jefferson were thought to be sympathetic to and even in league with France. Realists consider it a great strategic advantage that the United States is flanked by the Atlantic Ocean to the east and the Pacific Ocean to the west. Although modern times have made oceans no longer insuperable barrier, the United States neighbors of Canada and Mexico also present no strategic threat. Still, foreign policy was not 100% isolationist. After World War I, President Wilson kept America involved in foreign affairs with a 14-point plan for peace, which culminated in the Treaty of Versailles. The League of Nations that was created under the treaty was never joined by the United States. Panama Canal, Central American conflicts, and so on. It's also worth noting that America's domestic expansion, such as the fighting of the Mexican War, settling the West, and the 54-40 fight, border disputes cannot easily be counted with non-aggression, mind your own business, isolationist foreign policy. America's entry into World War I, a conflict between alliances of European powers to which the United States has no obligation, was decidedly interventionist. World War I ended with the Treaty of Versailles, which imposed harsh conditions of debt repayment on Germany. This in turn was the fertile soil for the ascendance of Hitler's regime. So until World War I, the United States was largely isolationist. George Washington specifically admonished against entangling alliances with other countries. The Monroe Doctrine declared that American neutrality and demanded Europe cease actions in the Americas. But we've not been entirely isolationist. We established different colonies, and we've maintained trade relationships with other countries. The Iron Curtain split Eastern and Western Europe as the East was under Soviet domination. Containment was the idea that America would use military, diplomatic, and economic strategies to prevent the communist Soviet Union from expanding its influence. Today, containment more generally describes efforts short of war to rein in rogue leaders of other nations. The Marshall Plan, International Monetary Fund, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and NATO all developed during this time. Depending on how one looks at it, this was a high point in liberal internationalism and global institutions. Another way to look at it is to say that the post-World War I period was the zenith of American leadership in the world. World War II led to internationalism. Prior to Pearl Harbor, the United States assisted Britain and the Allies in something called the Lend-Lease Act. Without directly becoming involved in foreign affairs, what we did was we lent and leased land, bases, and equipment to foreign countries that were fighting the Axis in World War II. The United States established a formal alliance during World War II, especially with Great Britain and with France. After World War II, scholars pushed for American involvement in world affairs. The Marshall Plan, which helped European nations rebuild their economies after World War II, was part of America's strategy to build alliances against the Soviet Union. Basically, instead of forcing Germany to repay its debts in the form of war reparations, which caused World War II to happen in the first place, what we did was we helped rebuild Western Germany. But Eastern Germany was under communist control, so we didn't help them. The Korean War was officially a mere police action, as America had no more appetite for war after the two world wars. The Cold War created the threat of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, in the event of a nuclear war. Competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, which became known as the Cold War, lasted from 1945 to 1991. The United States sought to contain Soviet influence in other countries, and it justified America's involvement in the Korean War through the domino theory, which justified involvement in such things as also the Vietnam War. Maintenance of large military force and nuclear buildup and mutually assured destruction, or MAD, were all policies of this period. The recent 2014 crisis in the Ukraine and in Georgia crisis of 2009 show that remnants of the Cold War continue to affect foreign policy today. Change began with Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved into 15 different countries, essentially ending the Cold War. But the Ukrainian conflict in 2014 shows that the Cold War does still continue today. And also, our discussion of Russian involvement in American elections shows that the Cold War is still going on today. In 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, which separated West Berlin from Communist East Berlin, provided a powerful symbol of the end of the Cold War. With just one superpower, the United States, left, many predicted that democracy would spread and peace would prevail. But new foreign policy challenges quickly emerged. The al-Qaeda terrorist organization headed by Osama bin Laden was the driving force behind many terrorist acts on Americans, including the 2001 attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. In 2011, American forces killed bin Laden, but the group, along with newer organizations such as ISIL, remains a significant threat. There are different approaches that have been taken by recent presidents. George W. Bush in the United States adopted a doctrine of preemption called the Bush Doctrine, which said that we were willing to use a unilateral approach to stop the spread of terrorism. And to go against any country that harbored terrorists. Barack Obama emphasized multilateralism, upholding aspects of Bush's agenda, particularly the use of drone forces. I would have to say that if you're going to look at the policy of President Trump, it's more of isolationism. So here are theories of foreign policy that we've talked about so far. Realism is foreign policy that is driven by a state's national interest as defined by its leaders. Idealism is foreign policy that reflects the ideals held by a state's leaders, such as the protection of human rights. Internationalism is that states should, whenever possible, pursue their foreign policy goals by working together with other nations. Isolationism is when states, whenever possible, work alone to define and implement their foreign policy, working with other nations only when absolutely necessary. And constructivism, and when foreign policy is not determined by objective factors such as national interest, but by ideologies such as idealism, or by admonitions about working alone or with other nations, but by how a state's leaders define these actions. Recall that the president is both the head of government, a domestic leader, and the head of the state, the representative of the United States to the outside world. The president is the dominant actor in American foreign policy. He's the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He negotiates treaties, signs executive agreements, and has appointment power over agencies and departments, all of which affect foreign policy. The National Security Council provides foreign policy options to the president. State Department is the principal foreign policy department. It's the Secretary of State that is the president's official spokesperson in foreign affairs. And it's crucially important that he become the advisor to the president. However, again, look under President Trump and you see a lot of tweeting going on that he's letting his thoughts be known outside of the national security and State Department foundations, and this can be problematic. Intelligence agencies are interesting for many reasons. For one, their budget is secret. Plus, there's the covertness and intrigue of their cloak and dagger operations. In foreign countries, they are often accused of sowing political discord, planning opposition to the ruling regime, or even organizing and staging coups. This is not without reason, of course. The United States did overthrow governments in Iran in 1953 and in Guatemala in 1954, and numerous assassination attempts were made against Fidel Castro. So, civilian control of the military involves having a Secretary of Defense over the Defense Department, having a civilian secretary over the Department of Homeland Security, which combines the Coast Guard, Transportation Security Administration, Border Patrol, and many other agencies to prevent future terrorist attacks and to coordinate the gathering of intelligence. Also, civilian oversight over intelligence agencies. National Security Agency, the Central Intelligence Agency, are both responsible for gathering intelligence. The NSA is responsible for gathering intelligence inside the United States. The Central Intelligence Agency is responsible for gathering intelligence outside of the United States. Diplomacy often involves protracted negotiations with many participants. The nuclear deal with Iran was negotiated by the government of Iran and representatives from China, Russia, the European Union, and the United States. The House and Senate each have an intelligence committee that oversees the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, and covert operations more generally. Congressional influence over foreign policy includes the power of the purse, the Senate's power to approve treaties and confirm appointments of the President's foreign policy team, the power to declare war. We've only had 5 declared wars in this nation's history, and we haven't had a declared war since World War II. The War Powers Resolution, which came in in the 1970s, which is supposed to limit the president's ability to commit the United States in a foreign war. Two standing congressional committees deal with foreign policy: the House Committee on Foreign Affairs and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. They write legislation, they set annual budgets, and they hold hearings in which foreign policy experts within and outside of government are questioned. Important Supreme Court cases that impacted foreign policy include the New York Times versus the United States in 1974, Razzle versus Bush in 2004, Rumsfeld versus Padilla in 2004, and Boumediene versus Bush in 2008. The Supreme Court uses judicial review to influence foreign policy. They forced the George W. Bush administration to change its policies regarding the holding of terror suspects. They required that suspects be charged with crimes and given trials, even if they're being held in Guantanamo. Groups representing foreign groups typically use the same strategies domestic interest groups use to influence policy. They work with legislators, provide policy expertise, and they may seek to mobilize the public to put pressure on lawmakers. Interest groups working for foreign countries work to influence government policy. Most lobbying focuses on economic and military aid or trade deals. Some lobbying forces domestic conflict between business interests and national security interests. And some groups publicize international events to stimulate citizen action on issues, particularly foreign affairs issues. Media coverage on foreign events has important implications for Americans' perceptions of those events. Public opinion influences foreign policy decisions though opposition is typically insufficient to stop a particular policy. It's possibly because politicians have goals beyond re-election, and it's possibly because Americans are not well versed in foreign policy and have ill-formed attitudes. Intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations act when the United States cannot or will not promote economic development and growth, provide humanitarian relief, or build democracies. NGOs, or non-governmental organizations, are things like the Red Cross and the United Nations. International organizations like the United Nations and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization promote peace and cooperation, uphold international law, and provide humanitarian aid. The tools of foreign policy and diplomacy is the process of using negotiations with foreign leaders and their emissaries to work out international agreements. In shuttle diplomacy, the United States mediates meetings separately with two nations that refuse to meet with each other and acts as an intermediary. The United States has moved to lower barriers and stimulate free trade, following the recommendations of most economists. While there are losers in free trade, particularly industrial jobs that have been replaced with lower-wage laborers abroad, the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, and the Central America Free Trade Agreement, or CAFTA, have facilitated economic growth. The World Trade Organization, or WTO, facilitates trade negotiations and intervenes when one country believes tariffs have been inappropriately applied. The United States has granted most favored nation status to several countries and to all members of the WTO. So, trade and economic policies sustain economic growth in the United States and abroad, create foreign markets for American-produced goods. Their main tools are tariffs and taxes and trade agreements, and they can use economic sanctions to threaten other countries. This is an area where a lot of change has been recommended by the president and his staff. He wants to pull out of NAFTA. He wants to pull out of CAFTA and a lot of other trade organizations. But the fact that it might bring a few jobs, maybe, does not negate the fact that it lowers the cost of goods for everyone when we're involved in a trade organization. This figure illustrates the importance of trade to the United States economy. In recent years, imports and exports have accounted for almost 40% of U.S. economic activity, and the percentage is increasing over time. Based on these data, What arguments would you make for lowering or increasing barriers to trade? One of the most conflictual issues involving international trade is the enforcement of copyrights on movies, music, and computer software. The Chinese government's refusal to enforce American copyrights has been a source of tension between the two nations. The tools of foreign policy and foreign aid are money, products, or services that are given to other countries. They have multiple goals. First, meeting fundamental human needs. Second, stimulating economic growth in other countries. And third, facilitating international agreements. This figure shows foreign and aid contributions expressed as a percentage of gross national income. Look at the data. Do these data imply that America is less generous than other nations in its willingness to donate aid? Take a look at Norway, which gives 1.09% of its GDP versus the United States, which gives 0.19%. Are we greedy? Of course, we have a much larger GDP than Norway, so consider that. Bilateral agreements are treaties between the United States and another country. Multilateral agreements are treaties between the United States and multiple countries. Treaties are agreements between nations who pledge to work together on security or economic development. Alliances are agreements that commit nations to specific security guarantees, such as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. The United States military serves as a deterrent to conflict. For example, United States troops on the border in South Korea. They fight in wars and conflict to further foreign policy goals. The size and power of the military offers numerous options for policymakers, and the military is still not all-powerful. Some problems simply cannot be solved with force. One of the most visible examples of globalization is the number of American companies that have opened stores or facilities in other countries. KFC, for example, has more than 4,600 stores in China. Another aspect of globalization is that factories are located wherever production costs are lowest. On the right, Chinese workers assemble electronic components for the global market. The United States economy is closely linked to other countries. This linkage is called globalization. Chinese-American interaction is critical for each country's economy. The American countries have factories in China, and American corporations are opening stores in China. But there's shared vulnerability. China holds billions of dollars in American bonds, and it simply can't leave America without hurting itself financially. One of the most visible examples of globalization here is the factories that are assembling electronic components in the global marketplace. The United States has dramatically weakened Al-Qaeda since September 11, 2001, but the threat of terrorist attacks remains with new threats like ISIS and ISIL. The fight against global terror is different than conventional war. Terrorism is hard to deter. You can't declare a war against the terrorists because terrorists are everywhere. Anti-terrorism efforts are often shaped by human rights concerns. As the Gallup poll here indicates, a substantial percentage of Americans worry that they or members of their family will be victims of a terrorist attack. In fact, these concerns even predate September 11th. Are the fears justified? How great is the risk? What do you think the numbers tell us? They tell us that you have a 1 in 110 million chance of a terrorist attack, a 1 in 7 million chance of being hit by lightning, a 1 in 6 million chance of a peanut allergy, a 1 in 2,500,000 chance of a commercial aviation accident, a 1 in 2 million chance of hitting a deer, a 1 in 1,500,000 chance of a home appliance blowing up on you, a 1 in 950,000 chance of drowning in the bathtub, a 1 in 480,000 chance of a natural disaster, a 1 in 53,000 chance of an industrial accident, a 1 in 22,000 chance of homicide, and a 1 in 8,200 chance of a traffic accident. North Korea has one of the world's least predictable and most isolated political regimes. Their nuclear capabilities and large military make North Korea a threat to the stability of the region. However, because of the poor state of the country's economy and economic sanctions are unlikely to foster change towards democracy and openness, even though we're expanding both the threat of military action and economic sanction. These are the foreign policy powers of the President and of Congress. The President has acts as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, nominates and appoints senior officials of the Department of Defense, negotiates treaties and executive agreements with other nations, changes policies with executive orders and findings, and attempts to mobilize public opinion behind foreign policy goals. Congress can declare war. The Senate must approve defense nominations. Treaties take effect only if they are approved by the Senate. The Senate can overturn orders and findings with legislation, and Congress can make policy using power of the purse annual budget decisions. U.S. politicians and government officials regularly speak at APAC events. Hillary Clinton is shown here with the APAC's annual convention. However, it would be a mistake to conclude that the attention paid to this or other interest groups automatically translates into U.S. government support for the group's policy proposals. The use of drones is controversial. Here, as a protester in Yemen holds a sign denouncing the practice. President Obama's trip to Vietnam in 2016 illustrates that one type of important foreign policy decision involves deciding which countries the president should visit and whom he or she should shake hands with while there. One of the United States strategies to increase the stability in Afghanistan is to train the Afghan National Army and police in order to provide the Afghan government with a greater level of control over the region so that we can pull away. All right, here's how things work in theory. The War Powers Act. Who controls the armed forces? The President has the power to deploy troops as Commander-in-Chief. Under the War Powers Resolution, he has to notify Congress, and the use of force must be terminated within 60 days if Congress does not approve. However, Congress has never voted to terminate military action, and most presidents have argued that the act is unconstitutional. Congress has the power to declare war, and it has not used this power since World War II. It has the power of the purse and can provide or withhold funding of military action. In practice, let's look at America's role in Libya's civil war. We had a no-fly zone. March 1st, Senate passes non-binding resolution calling for a no-fly zone over Libya. Americans and NATO naval forces move in position off of the Libyan coast. March the 7th to the 14th, international leaders and organizations call for a no-fly zone. March 17th, the United Nations Security Council passes a resolution calling for a no-fly zone. March the 18th, President Obama met with senior members of Congress. Meanwhile, on March 19th, U.S. and NATO forces began to carry out airstrikes on Libyan ground targets, enforcing no-fly zone and sending military supplies to Libyan rebels. Congress should know. March the 21st, President Obama sends a letter to Congress and leaders formally notifying Congress of America's involvement in Libyan conflict. America should know. President Obama gave a speech to the nation on the Libyan operation. So what do you think? On May the 11th, President Obama called on Congress to approve American involvement in Libyan operations. On June 15th, House Speaker Boehner sent President Obama a letter warning that he would be in violation of the War Powers Act unless Congress voted to approve Libyan operations. Nope. On June 24th, approval resolution was disapproved in the House. However, attempts to cut off funds for operations were also rejected. That's the kicker. Once the president commits, how are you going to defund an existing military operation? From June to November, Libyan airstrikes and no-fly zone and shipments continued until the Libyan operation ended on